Question is, order. The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I knew if we waited around here long enough, we would hear that if we don't do this, we'll end up like Greece or Spain or Italy. It is the classic, isn't it? You've got to look offshore and say, if we don't sell off our assets, we're going to be like Greece. What a lot of nonsense. What an absolute travesty of the truth. That's absolute nonsense. We may be finishing this piece of legislation in this House today, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you what, the fight is not finished. It will be out of here and onto the streets. That's where it's going. That's where we continue to fight this battle to keep our assets, because we are taking the petition to have a referendum on these asset sales to the people of New Zealand. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that when you go out there and ask people to sign the petition, they clamour to sign the petition. They stand in line to sign the petition, and not just, as Mr. Key would say, people who vote Green or Labour or whoever. These are National Party supporters who are standing in line, and they say that. They come up to you and they say, look, I voted National, but I'm willing to sign this petition because I totally disagree with this government selling off our assets. And so today, Mr. Speaker, in the third reading, this legislation is likely to go through. But it is likely to go through with a wafer-thin majority brought about by Peter Dunn of United Future, who hasn't really taken a very active part, I have to say, in this legislation. I think he's maybe spoken once, but he is certainly not taking an active part in this debate, and why would he? Because we know that in his electorate, where we have been collecting the most signatures of any of the electorates around the country, they are dead against him selling off and putting his name alongside the national government and selling off our legislation, Mr. Speaker. So it's a wafer-thin majority that's coming before this House, and our assets are being sold off in a piece of legislation that can only be seen and understood as being particularly obnoxious, Mr. Speaker. So let's ask a few questions about this legislation. Will we be better off? Actually, no. It's a little bit like selling a profitable business to put an extension onto your house. What you end up losing, Mr. Speaker, is the revenue that's coming in to the government. The revenue. Year after year after year, we will lose this revenue to people of New Zealand. Will this mean we have more risk? Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Because right even today we have Tū Wharetoa, we have the Maori Council, who are actually putting in court cases and claims against this legislation. And who bears the cost of that? The taxpayer will bear the cost. The taxpayer will only own, according to Mr. Ryle, 51%, but it'll take the entire risk of any litigation against this legislation. So the taxpayer will take all the risk. The taxpayer will lose out on the revenue. And what about the cost? What about the cost to put this through? Well, Goldman Sachs, Macquarie Bank, those banks are going to receive around about $120 million in revenue to actually put this deal through. Well, I can think of a lot more things that I'd rather like to do with $120 million, and that might include actually decreasing class sizes. It might even go to getting behind and reversing, Mr. Speaker, the $45 million that this government took out of improving teacher in-service training. That's supposed to increase teacher quality that now this government decided it wants to fix. And what about power prices? Well, Mr. Ryle is leaving the chamber before he hears this.
Order. The member must not refer.
Mr. Speaker. What about power prices? Well, let's as an indicator of what's going to happen to power prices, let's look what's happening already to the directors of these companies. They have just doubled their compensation. $2,500 a day. That's good work when you can get it, isn't it? $2,500 a day that you'll receive if you're a director on these companies. So already they're not even sold off, and they've bumped up their compensation for being a director. And where is that money going to come from? Well, the only place it's going to come from, Mr. Speaker, is out of the pockets of New Zealanders, because they're the people who are paying the power prices. So are power prices going to go up? Of course they're going to go up. Of course they're going to go up, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing surer than power prices going up. And are these shares going to end up in corporate ownership? Well, of course they're going to end up in corporate overseas ownership, Mr. Speaker. Of course they are, because if they don't, they won't get the price that they need. And that's what Treasury told the government. You've got to sell overseas, otherwise you won't get the price. And so did the government put mums and dads, that cutesy little phrase, mums and dads, in the legislation to make sure that the government, that these mums and dads, these New Zealand investors, will get to the front of the queue? Well, no, of course it didn't do that. Of course it didn't do that for the simple reason that it didn't put it in its legislation. If it was going to guarantee it, it would have put it in the legislation, Mr. Speaker, and it didn't do that either. So here we are, Mr. Speaker, standing in front of a piece of legislation that is obnoxious to New Zealanders. More than two-thirds of New Zealanders do not like this legislation, do not support this legislation. More than 100,000 people out there already in a few weeks have signed on to the citizens-initiated referendum and are queuing up to sign. And this government is still persisting in putting through this piece of obnoxious legislation. And as Grant Robinson just said, this government is so out of touch with the way ordinary New Zealanders feel, the way the New Zealanders feel about selling off their assets. And Mr. Ryle has the audacity to say that when Labor sold off assets in the 1980s, 2.5 generations ago almost, that somehow this is less bad. That was awful, but this is somehow less bad. It's still bad, but it's just slightly less bad than what it was in the 1980s. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is still bad. It is still bad policy, and to liken New Zealand's situation to that of Spain and Greece, frankly, is an insult to New Zealand and an insult to the people who work so hard. So, Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party will be working hard out in the streets to get those 300,000 signatures, and as I say, they are queuing up to sign that petition, and we will bring that back to this House, and we will bring that back to this House, and we will have a referendum on whether New Zealanders want this or not. And I can tell you now the way that the referendum is going to go, and it's not going to go well for the government. And it's going to go in 2013 or maybe even 2014. There's going to be a referendum on asset sales that will flow through to the election in 2014, Mr. Speaker, and the one after that, because New Zealanders do not want these assets to be sold. And if that is not a government out of touch, and if that is not a government as arrogantly dismissing the wishes and the desires of New Zealanders, I don't know what is. I don't know what is, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you, and I can give you the commitment right now, that the Labor Party will be out there fighting every inch of the way to make sure that these assets are not sold. We will be out there, come rain, sunshine, out there to get those signatures to make sure that a referendum goes ahead, Mr. Speaker, and the New Zealanders get a real chance to have a say in the future of their country. Thank you.
I call the